This here is a traditional Jewish tale called The Beggar King and the Melamed. In the city of Amsterdam there once lived a king, and this king knew several languages, Hebrew among them. Going to bathe in the river one day, he happened to pass through the Jewish ghetto. There was a small house where a traditional Jewish school teacher, a Melamed, was teaching children the following passage. God topples the mighty to the ground and raises the lowly to the heavens. Getting out of his coach, the king went to the house and asked the Melamed what those words meant. Not understandable to a king, and deeply frightening, probably. The meaning was, the Melamed replied, a quite simple one. God can turn a king into a beggar and a beggar into a king. Hearing this, the king was very angry. "Prove it to me personally and I'll reward you," he said. "But if you can't, I'll have you beheaded." It's very kingly and self-assured of him. And at the Melamed he said he would indeed prove it, on condition that the king stay away from his house for at least 5 days. And the king promised. As it happened, this Melamed was one of the 36 holy men without whom the world could not exist. They're called, here they're called the Lamed of Tzadek, but sometimes they're also called the Lamed Wufniks. And so this Lamed of Tzadek sat down and prayed. Meanwhile, the king went on his way to the river, and after turning his clothes over to a servant, he jumped into the water. In a minute, a demon out of hell assumed the king's shape and emerged from the river. The demon called the servant to bring him his clothes, then dressed himself in the royal garments and rode home to the palace. When the true king had had a good swim, feeling refreshed, he came out of the water and called his servant, but there was neither sound nor reply. The king shouted louder and louder and ran about, trying to find his clothes and the carriage. He was running around naked, and naked he searched for hours, until he was frozen, bitterly cold. Finally, he went home, still without clothing, completely naked. The peasants in the street were amazed at the sight of a naked man shouting that he was the king. One even started to strike him with a whip, but an old peasant stopped him and then gave the king a ragged coat to cover himself. The king went to his palace, but the soldiers guarding the gate drove him away, saying, "We don't allow beggars to approach the king's residence." The peasants pitied the refined-looking beggar, but none of them believed him when he claimed he was the king. Everyone knew that the king was exactly where he was supposed to be, wearing a beautiful robe and a crown, sitting on the throne. And that was how the king came to be a beggar. When he wanted to sleep, he had to go to the place where all the beggars spend the night. So, after 2 days, he left the city and went off to beg in the company of several other poor people like himself. Little by little, the king got used to this new life, traveling from town to town in the company of beggars. One day he was passing through the capital city again and found himself in the street that led to the river. From the house of the Melamed came the teacher's voice, discussing the same passage and interpreting it to mean that God could turn a king into a beggar and a beggar into a king. The king went into the house and begged the Melamed's forgiveness for having doubted him. And he asked the Melamed to help him become a king again. The teacher promised that he would. The first thing he did was to trim the king's matted hair and beard. Then he bathed him and ordered a tailor to make him new clothes fit for a king. After that was done, he told him to go to church and wait outside. At the time, the king usually went to pray. When he saw the false king's coach drive up and the impostor enter the church, then he, the real king, should call his coachman by name. The king, now dressed like a king, did everything the Melamed advised him to do. On Sunday he stood outside the church and waited till the impostor drove up. When the false king was inside the church, and after the first prayer was recited, the real king called the coachman, who drove up at once and helped him into the coach. So the king drove home, and no one was any the wiser. When the demon king discovered the trick, he fled back to his place in hell. Then the real king commanded that the Melamed be brought to him at the palace. He thanked him for his help and rewarded him royally. And from then on and to the end of his days, that king was a friend to the Jews. So at least goes the story. Well, let's assume another one where the demon king continued to be king, to be replaced by another demon king and yet another demon king in turn, and they're all tricking each other, pretending who is going to be the real king, because, well, in reality, there's probably no king who is a friend to beggars and is full of humility like that. And it shows you, perhaps, if there's any moral that you need. In order to feel humility, you need, perhaps, if you don't feel it naturally, a fair bit of humiliation. Again, let's be friend to all people, and let's be humble.